To anyone looking in from the outside, my marriage probably looked like a success story. Good house in a quiet subdivision outside of Barrie, Ontario. Steady jobs. Well, one steady job, which was my husband's. A mother-in-law who smiled with all her teeth at every family dinner. I was 31 years old, and I had somehow become invisible inside my own life. My husband, I'll call him what his mother called him, her golden boy, had a way of making me feel lucky just to be near him, not through kindness, through subtraction. Over 5 years, he had quietly removed everything that made me feel like a person with her own gravity. First, it was the suggestion that I leave my marketing coordinator position because the commute was stressing me out. Then it was the joint account where I had to explain every e-transfer. Then it was the slow, steady, almost imperceptible erosion of my confidence until I genuinely could not remember what I had been like before I met him. I know now that this is a pattern. I didn't know it then. I just thought I was difficult. My mother-in-law moved in with us 2 years after the wedding. My husband presented it the way he presented everything, as a fact that had already been decided, dressed up in the language of a question. Mom's lease is up and she's been having trouble with her knee. It just makes sense, doesn't it? And because I had been trained by then to treat his rhetorical questions as agreements I had already made, I said yes. I unpacked her things into the guest room. I rearranged my own bathroom cabinet to make space for her prescriptions. She was not a cruel woman in an obvious way. She didn't shout. She had a gift instead, for the kind of comment that sounds like concern and lands like a slap. Oh, you made pasta again? I just worry about the carbs for your sake. Or, that blouse is very colorful, very youthful. She called me sweetheart with the warmth of someone addressing a golden retriever that had chewed the furniture but was still basically tolerable. My husband watched all of it and said nothing. That was the thing I kept coming back to, even in those years when I was making excuses for him. He never said anything. I found out about her, the other woman, in the most mundane way imaginable. I was looking for a phone charger in his car, and I found a lip gloss in the console. It was a shade I would never wear, coral pink and glossy, the kind of thing that assumes confidence. I held it in my hand for a long time. I put it back exactly where I'd found it. I went inside and made dinner, and I did not say a word. For 3 weeks I watched. I'm not proud of how quickly I became good at this, at listening without appearing to listen, at noticing what I had trained myself not to notice. He was going to client dinners on Tuesday evenings. He had started keeping his phone face down on every surface. He was paying for things in cash, which he had never done before, because we were the kind of household that optimized credit card points. The evidence was not subtle. I think, on some level, he didn't bother to hide it well because he had stopped thinking of me as someone who would do anything about it. That assumption was going to be his most expensive mistake. I called my oldest friend, the one who had been my roommate at Laurier, who had stood beside me at the wedding with a smile that I now understood had been more complicated than I'd realized, and I told her everything. Not on the phone. In person, over coffee at her kitchen table in Guelph, with the door closed and her kids at school. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she said, "Okay, so what do you want to do?" Not, "What are you going to do?" "What do you want to do?" I hadn't been asked that in years. "I want him to feel what I've been feeling," I said, "and then I want to leave." She nodded slowly. "Well," she said, "let's think about the order of operations." Her name is Celeste. She works in HR for a mid-sized logistics company, and she has a mind like a filing cabinet, organized, thorough, and impossible to rattle. She was the one who suggested I speak to a family lawyer before I said a single word to my husband. She was the one who reminded me about the RRSP contributions I had made before we merged our finances, the ones he had started treating as shared assets. She was the one who drove with me to a legal clinic in downtown Guelph and sat in the waiting room while I spoke to a lawyer for 45 minutes. I want to be clear about this, because it matters. Before I did anything theatrical, I did everything practical. I know that is not the exciting part of the story, but it is the part that actually protected me. I opened a new bank account at a different institution. I quietly moved what was legally mine. I made copies of every document I could find: mortgage statements, investment accounts, the deed to the house that had been purchased before the marriage, and was therefore not as straightforward as he believed. I built a folder on a USB drive and I gave it to Celeste for safekeeping. And then I waited. The opportunity came in the middle of October, which, if you're from Ontario, you know is the kind of month that can break your heart with its beauty right before it turns cold. He told me at breakfast, over coffee, without looking up from his phone, that he would be having some colleagues over for dinner on Saturday. A small thing, he said, just a few people from the office. He'd like it if I could make something nice. I asked who would be coming. He listed 3 names, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said her name. He was watching me when he said it, in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed the casualness of a thing. Her name meant nothing to me out loud. I had only known her as a probability, as a lip gloss in a car console. But something in his face told me that he thought this was a test he had already passed. "Of course," I said. "I'll make something nice." He looked almost disappointed. I called Celeste from the parking lot of the grocery store on Thursday afternoon. "Saturday," I said. She didn't ask for context. "I'll be there," she said. "What time?" This is the part where I need to explain something about Celeste, because it matters enormously to what happened next. Celeste had been seeing someone for about 8 months, someone she had met through a work conference in Calgary, a quiet, steady man named Drew who managed operations for a company based out of Edmonton. They had been doing the long-distance thing, flying back and forth, the way people do when they find something worth the inconvenience. Drew had a habit of flying in on weekends when he could manage it. Celeste had mentioned him to me a handful of times. I had not yet met him. I had, however, done what any person does with a friend's new partner. I had looked at his LinkedIn profile, and then I had forgotten about it. Or thought I had. On Saturday morning, I got up early and made a beef bourguignon, which is a dish that takes patience and rewards it. My mother-in-law supervised from the kitchen doorway, offering adjustments I hadn't requested. I smiled. I stirred. I was completely calm, the way you are calm when you have already made every important decision and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. Celeste arrived at 6, just before the other guests, wearing a dark green coat I hadn't seen before. Drew was with her, which I had expected. He was taller than his LinkedIn photo suggested, with kind eyes and the slightly weather-worn look of someone who spends time outdoors in Alberta winters. He shook my hand and said it was lovely to finally meet me, and I told him the same, and I meant it. My husband opened the door for the other 2 colleagues. They came in with wine and the kind of slightly performative cheer that people bring to dinners they feel obligated to attend. And then the last car pulled into the driveway. I was standing at the kitchen counter when she walked in. She was, and I want to be honest about this, because I think minimizing her would actually diminish what I felt, striking, put together. The kind of woman who knows exactly how she reads when she enters a room and has decided to own it. My husband took her coat with a gesture so practiced it barely registered, except to me, because I had never once seen him take anyone's coat. She introduced herself to the room with a small wave, easy and confident. She was holding a bottle of Prosecco. She looked at me with the polite blankness of someone meeting an obstacle they've already decided not to worry about. And then Celeste stepped forward to say hello. The Prosecco hit the floor before either of us fully understood what was happening. It didn't shatter. It was a carpeted area near the entrance, but it landed with a thud that stopped every conversation in the room. And the sound that came out of her was not quite a word. It was the sharp intake before a word. The breath a person takes when the ground has moved. She looked at Drew with an expression I recognized immediately as the face of someone whose entire internal architecture has just been condemned. Drew's expression was slower to change. The way understanding sometimes takes a moment to reach the surface of a quiet person. When it did, it was not loud. It was a very particular, very Canadian kind of stillness, the kind that is somehow worse than shouting. "Megan," he said. Just her name, nothing else needed. My husband looked between them with the expression of a man watching a car accident happen in slow motion on a road he had personally salted. My mother-in-law, who had been emerging from the hallway with a dish towel, stopped completely. I picked up the Prosecco from the floor. "Can I get everyone something to drink?" I said. The dinner did not happen, not in any real sense. The woman, Megan, apparently, I had only known her as a probability, left within 15 minutes, in the fragmented, overcoated way of someone leaving a place they no longer have any claim to. Drew followed shortly after, not in anger, but in the deliberate, careful manner of a man who needed to be somewhere else to process what had just happened. I felt genuinely sorry for him, if I'm honest. He was collateral in a story he hadn't written. Celeste stayed. She helped me transfer the beef bourguignon into containers in the kitchen because it was too good to waste, and she talked to me quietly while my husband sat in the living room with a glass of rye whiskey and did not seem to know what to do with his face. His colleagues had evaporated. His mother had retreated to her room. The sound of a hockey game he wasn't watching drifted down the hallway. He came into the kitchen eventually. He stood in the doorway the way he used to stand in the doorways of arguments, taking up space without committing to a direction. "You knew," he said. "I found out," I said. "There's a difference." "How long?" "Long enough to have spoken to a lawyer." I turned around and looked at him, probably for the first time in a year in the sense of actually seeing him. "The paperwork is already started. I'm not asking you to leave tonight. But I am asking you to understand that this is happening." He said several things after that. I don't need to repeat them here, because they were the things people say when the version of events they've constructed no longer holds, when they're scrambling for a new story that makes them less responsible. He tried anger. He tried reason. He briefly tried something that might have been remorse, though it was hard to distinguish from self-pity. I let him talk. I had already decided that I was not going to perform grief for his benefit. I had done enough performing in that house. My mother-in-law appeared in the hallway at some point and said quietly that she thought I was being very cold. I told her just as quietly that she was welcome to form her own opinion, that I hoped she found a comfortable living arrangement that suited her, that I had enjoyed getting to know her over the past few years and wished her well. Every word of it delivered with complete sincerity and an absolute absence of the deference she had come to expect from me. She looked at me as though she was seeing me for the first time. Maybe she was. I moved out of the master bedroom that night and slept in the office. Over the following 3 weeks, the household rearranged itself the way households do when a marriage is ending, with awkward logistics and pointed silences and the slow process of sorting out which objects belong to which life. My husband hired a lawyer. My lawyer was better. I had prepared for this possibility longer than he knew. He left before Christmas. My mother-in-law, it turned out, had a sister in Hamilton who had more space than she'd let on, and she moved there in November with less argument than I'd anticipated. I think, somewhere underneath everything, she understood that the situation had already collapsed, and she had been living inside the aftermath for longer than she realized. The house was quiet in a way that took some getting used to. Celeste brought me a plant in December, one of those low-maintenance succulents, which she said was symbolic of surviving with very little input, which made me laugh for the first time in what felt like months. Drew had ended things with Megan. He and Celeste were still figuring out what they were to each other, as people are when something they thought they understood turns out to be more complicated. I hoped they would find their way through it. I still do. I started working again in January, contract work at first, then a full-time position with a small brand consultancy in Barrie that a former colleague had flagged for me. The commute I had apparently been so stressed about turned out to be 40 minutes and entirely manageable. I bought a travel mug I liked and made playlists for the drive. Small things. They mattered. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is this. The most dangerous thing I ever did was let someone else be in charge of my financial life. Not because of what it cost me in the divorce, though it cost me time and stress and lawyers' fees I hadn't planned for, but because of what it cost me inside my own sense of who I was. When you don't have access to your own money, you don't fully have access to your own choices. You start to confuse dependence with love. You start to mistake being needed for being valued. I am not telling anyone what to do with their marriage or their finances or their life. I am just telling you what I learned from mine. My own name is on my own accounts now. My credit score is mine. My retirement savings are mine. When I look at my bank app on a Tuesday morning before work, the number I see represents decisions I made, which is a feeling I cannot fully explain to anyone who has not had it taken away. I turned 32 in April. Celeste took me to a small restaurant in Guelph, the kind of place with exposed brick and a short menu written on a chalkboard, and we had wine and roasted chicken, and we talked until the staff were visibly waiting for us to leave. She told me that Drew was flying in the following weekend, and that she had decided, finally, that the distance was worth the inconvenience. I drove home on the 401 with the windows down even though it was still a little cold, because I wanted to feel the air. I was free, and for the first time in years, free felt like exactly the right size. I think about that October dinner more than I expected to, not the Prosecco hitting the floor, not the look on my husband's face, though I'd be lying if I said those images don't still surface sometimes, unbidden, on a quiet commute home. What I think about most is the version of myself who had been standing in that kitchen for 5 years without fully realizing she had stopped moving. There's a version of the story where I stayed, where I talked myself out of what I knew, where I decided that the lip gloss in the console was explainable, that the cash payments were a quirk, that the Tuesday evenings were exactly what he said they were. I was close to that version, closer than I'd like to admit, and what pulled me back wasn't anger. It was the moment Celeste asked me what I wanted, and I genuinely couldn't answer her. That silence told me everything. I've thought a lot about what actually changes a life, and I don't think it's the dramatic moments. It's the small decisions made before the dramatic moments that determine how they land. The lawyer's appointment, the new bank account, the USB drive sitting in Celeste's kitchen drawer. None of those things felt significant while I was doing them. They felt like paperwork, but they were the difference between leaving with my footing and leaving in free fall. What I had to rebuild, more than finances, was my own judgment. My husband had spent years, quietly, consistently, without ever raising his voice, teaching me not to trust it. And I had cooperated. That's the part that took the longest to sit with. Not forgiving him. Forgiving myself for having confused his certainty with reliability, his control with care. Celeste is one of the most decent people I know, and she showed me something important that year, that being a good person is not the same as being a passive one. She was honest with me when honesty was uncomfortable. She sat in a legal clinic waiting room on a Wednesday afternoon without being asked twice. She brought me a succulent in December and made me laugh. Goodness, I've come to understand, is not soft. It has spine. It shows up. It does the practical thing alongside the kind thing, and it doesn't confuse the two. What carried me through the actual leaving, the lawyers, the divided furniture, the first weeks of a quieter house, was something I didn't have a name for at the time. I'd call it now a kind of stubbornness in service of something real. Not stubbornness for its own sake, not pride, but the refusal to abandon the version of myself I could still remember existing before I met him. She was still there, a little quieter, a little more careful, but there. I kept going back to her like a reference point. I'm not standing here, or wherever one stands at the end of a story like this, telling you that everything worked out cleanly. Divorce is expensive and slow and sad even when it's right. Drew and Celeste had hard conversations I was not privy to. The house sold in spring for less than we'd hoped. There were nights in that first winter when the quiet wasn't peaceful, It was just quiet. But I drove home on the 401 in April with the windows down, and the air was cold enough to matter, and I felt not happy exactly, but real. Grounded in my own life in a way I hadn't been in years. That feeling was worth everything it cost to get there.